Mississippi is the U.S. state, with a GDP of $115 billion. Located in the heart of the American South, it is notoriously known for its rich artistic tradition, beautiful natural landscapes, and primarily for being the poorest state in the country. In this context, Mississippi has the highest poverty rate in the nation, with 19.5% of its 2.8 million residents living in poverty. Additionally, it has the lowest Human Development Index, HDI, and the lowest life expectancy in the United States. Mississippi's issues go beyond poverty. Various structural problems exacerbate the state's challenges, such as flawed public policies, persistent segregation dating back to the era of slavery, and one of the least educated populations in the country. Only 23% of Mississippi's workforce holds a college degree, well below the national average of 37%. In this video, we will analyze why Mississippi is the poorest state in the United States and explore the key factors that have led to this condition. To understand the current situation in which Mississippi finds itself, with some of the worst economic indicators in the United States, it's essential to revisit its troubled past, which has limited the state's ability to implement more effective proposals for economic growth. We need to go back to the late 18th century, when the United States gained independence from Britain, officially establishing Mississippi as a state. During this period, the settlement of Mississippi was closely tied to the fertility of its soil, shaped by geological and climatic factors that made the land extremely fertile. The first of these factors is the Mississippi River Delta, located in the northwest of the state, which contributes to the enrichment of the region's soil. Coupled with this, the predominantly warm climate throughout the year shapes the state's economic dynamics, with a focus on grain and cotton cultivation. This agricultural appeal drew thousands of immigrants to the state in search of farming opportunities. However, just as the colonization and settlement of Mississippi happened quickly, slavery also expanded rapidly in the region, lasting for over a century. To illustrate, in 1820, there were about 33,000 enslaved people in the state. But by 1860, that number had risen to 437,000, representing more than half of Mississippi's population. At the height of the slave system that prevailed in the United States, Mississippi was, by far, the state with the highest number of enslaved individuals in the country. This system sustained the local economy, fueling a market that few other regions could maintain at the time. The state's productive capacity was so vast that in 1860, Mississippi was the wealthiest state in the nation, with cotton as the driving force of its economy. Cotton production had expanded by 600% since 1820, dominating not only the state's exports, producing thousands of tons of cotton annually, but also U.S. exports overall. At that time, approximately 75% of the cotton supplied to the British textile industry came from the southern United States, with Mississippi leading in production. On the other hand, while the state had reached an unprecedented level of wealth and prosperity, the social disparity between the abolitionist North and the slaveholding South served as the spark for the American Civil War, from 1861 to 1865. On one side were the southern states, dependent on slave labor to sustain their agrarian export-based economy. On the other, the industrialized North, holding liberal ideals and moral principles that condemned slavery. The conflict was triggered soon after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln advocated for a country without slavery, prompting many states, particularly in the South, to seek secession from the Union and form the Confederacy. Mississippi was the second state to declare secession in 1861, following South Carolina, sparking the American Civil War, which would last 4 years and lead to over 600,000 deaths, according to estimates. Despite playing a leading role in providing soldiers and vital resources, the consequences of the conflict were devastating for Mississippi, especially after the Confederacy's defeat and the military occupation of southern states, until they were reintegrated into the Union. During this period, slavery was abolished, leading to the decline of agricultural production and the major southern plantations, which no longer had the same labor force. Among the states most affected was Mississippi, which lacked a strong or well-established industry to replace its agricultural model. This problem gave rise to conflicting proposals, such as the sharecropping model, where landowners agreed to give a portion of the crop to the worker. This model became a catalyst for social conflicts and terrorist movements against African Americans in the state, along with resistance from the local political and economic elite to adopt changes necessary for Mississippi to rejoin the Union, which finally occurred in 1870. Among these resistances to the social integration of African Americans were the Jim Crow laws, which lasted from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century. These laws were a set of state and local statutes that institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination against the black population, enforcing strict separation between whites and blacks in nearly all aspects of public and social life, from schools and public transportation to restaurants and hospitals. This context created a loophole for the emergence and popularization of supremacist groups. Since then, the state's widespread problems only began to stabilize and become less severe in the second half of the 20th century. So, how did Mississippi become the poorest state in the United States? Based on what we've discussed, it's clear that poverty and hardship dominated Mississippi for over a century, while slavery was the way of life for half its population, with a small elite reaping the benefits of the state's status as one of the richest in the country during the 19th century. Although the Civil War devastated the logistical infrastructure and disrupted the prevailing economic model, the new century brought Mississippi the difficult task of economic restructuring. The state's economic issues were structural, lacking a strong industrial tradition like the one that existed in the northern United States. Its reliance on primary products, mostly agricultural, hindered any significant shift in economic development. This explains why, by the late 1960s, around 40% of the population lived in poverty. Diversifying the economy was essential to attracting income and improving the quality of life, a shift that began in the second half of the 20th century as manufacturing industries were established in the state, spurred by a series of economic and tax incentives aimed at attracting companies. Among these incentives was an industrial development plan proposed by the state in 1936, which directly impacted infrastructure modernization, including roads, ports, and expanded basic services like healthcare and financial assistance, through grants and low-interest loans for businesses. Gradually, these measures encouraged industry to become the leading employment sector in Mississippi by 1965. When we look internally at Mississippi, one could argue that the state left the 20th century in better condition than it entered. However, on a regional level, Mississippi still lags, unable to compete with its neighboring states on major economic indicators. This disparity is even more evident, as Mississippi has the lowest GDP per capita in the nation, at just $9,000. By comparison, its neighbors Alabama and Louisiana have GDPs per capita that are 11% and 18% higher, respectively. Compared to New York, the state with the highest GDP per capita, this gap is even more striking. While GDP per capita doesn't directly translate to individual wealth, analyzing this ratio helps us understand the state's development and its capacity for economic output. In this respect, Mississippi falls far short. Its economic structure, although diversified, fails to meet the needs of its population, particularly regarding income and quality of life, which perhaps explains why Mississippi is one of the most unequal states in the United States. This is reflected in the state's Gini coefficient of 0.489, higher than the national average of 0.481, and the fourth highest among all 50 states. Additionally, Mississippi has the highest poverty rate in the nation, with 19.5% of its 2.8 million residents living in poverty. The state also has the lowest Human Development Index (HDI) in the United States. The current situation in Mississippi is bleak, with one of the worst educational systems in the country, inadequate infrastructure, a lack of basic services, and inefficient policies deeply impacting its social, economic, and political fabric. Today, only 23% of Mississippi's workforce has a college degree. This low number discourages companies from setting up operations in the state due to the lack of qualified professionals for complex and specialized work. This tradition of a less skilled workforce explains why Mississippi's average income is 51% below the U.S. average. Therefore, although Mississippi was once one of the richest states in the United States, political and social conflicts hindered the stability needed to create more efficient and dynamic development proposals. A good example of this is the state's delayed industrialization and socio-economic inequality compared to the rest of the country. To address these issues, Mississippi needs to adopt more inclusive policies, improve education, qualify its workforce, encourage economic diversification, and increase competitiveness in its internal market. By doing so, the state could once again stand out economically. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If possible, comment below on the next topic you'd like to see on the channel. Also, like the video, subscribe, and share the content with your friends. Thanks again for your support, and see you in the next video.